got like 7 something.
I'll just check on the menu.
Intel. This
Good.
is where it all changes.
So there's isolationism, right? It's the idea of choosing not to get involved. So if we look at the history of our country, George Washington in 1796 tells us to stay out of the affairs of other countries. And so this idea of isolationism. And then you have internationalism, so beginning with like the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, where we said that we would defend Latin American countries from European expansion. Internationalism means that you get involved in the side of a friend, especially if it benefits us. And then there's collective security. So collective security is the United States is really not going to participate in terms of collective security until after World War II when they joined the United Nations. It's the idea of grabbing allies and putting an end to a conflict. So this idea of team. Then, of course, there's imperialism, right? Forcing for economic, social, and political reasons. So the idea of bullying another nation. And so what you have here is, of course, the Berlin Conference in 1884, where you have all these nations who essentially tried to take and carve up Africa, right? So again, we will do the same thing, but not necessarily with Africa. So why does imperialism happen? It happens because of nationalism, right? Nationalism is this idea of extreme pride in your country, and you have to be extremely proud in your country to believe that it benefits you to go in and conquer another people. It happens because of militarism, right? You need to be able to have militarized in order to be able to conquer another people. And if you think about it, right, militarizing costs a nation a lot of money, and a lot of the taxpayers a lot of money. And so one way to convince the taxpayers that that money should be spent on the military is by making them very nationalistic, because then they won't ask questions. And then, of course, there's economics, right? So new markets, so a need to be able to sell our stuff, and then, of course, natural resources. There's also this idea of global Darwinism, right? This idea that if we don't do it, somebody else will do it to us. And then during this time, we also had an American naval captain by the name of Alfred T. Mahan, who wrote something called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in it, he argued that if we looked at the history of the world, at least over the last, or between 1660 and 1783, he who controls the Navy controls the ocean and therefore controls the world. So he argued that the United States needed to increase the size of its Navy. And then you had humanitarian, right? So humanitarianism is this love for human life. And so what we see is we saw people who tried to justification for imperialism, that we are going to go and make other people better. And in England, right, of course, we have the famous author Rudyard Kipling, who wrote The Jungle Book. And in it, he argued this idea of the white man's burden, right? That we, the white man, needed to uplift the darker-skinned people of the world. So one of the areas that we're going to look at 3 different areas. We're going to look at the Caribbean, we're going to look at the Pacific, and then, of course, China. One of the areas that, of course, is going to become really important is Hawaii. In 1820, the first U.S. missionaries actually arrived in Hawaii by boat. We signed treaties in 1875 and 1887 guaranteeing commercial trade and rights to Pearl Harbor. So we began trading with Hawaii, and of course we were able to get permission to use Pearl Harbor. Americans who had become sort of entrenched in Hawaii began demanding for the annexation, the addition of Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii, of course, opposed the annexation. And she had a good relationship with President Grover Cleveland, who actually opposed the annexation out of respect for Hawaii and for the Queen. So Hawaii actually won't be annexed until 1898, when the Spanish-American War begins. So how do we get to the Spanish-American War? So Cuba was one of the last colonies of Spain left in the New World. And so the Cubans had actually tried unsuccessfully to revolt prior. And then in 1895, led by a Cuban poet by the name of José Martí, the Cuban people chanting Cuba Libre in 1895 declared their independence from Spain. And the Spanish government, of course, responded by saying absolutely not. And so the Cuban people, because they knew that they could not defeat the Spanish, decided, well, the reason that Spain is here is for our natural resources. And so one of the things that the Cuban people did is they turned to guerrilla tactics, and they began to actually scorch the earth. So they began burning their own crops. And the idea was, if the Spaniards are here for our crops, then we'll burn the crops and the Spaniards will leave, right? Well, wait a minute. Why would you burn the crops? Don't you need the crops? And it was one of these things where the Cuban people felt like it was a sacrifice that they needed to make in order to get the Spanish out. So the Spanish, what they did is they actually sent their general, a guy by the name of Valeriano Weyler, one of their generals, to deal with it. And one of the things that he did is he began capturing some of the Cuban leaders, and they began putting some of the Cuban people in what, again, we refer to as concentration camps. The United States, there were Americans who began reading about what was happening, and they were concerned, and they wanted to see the United States get involved. The problem is, since Cuba was an old colony of Spain, the Monroe Doctrine dictated that we could not get involved because it was an old colony. So we needed an excuse to be able to get involved. And so one of the things that happened was, at this time, we have two very famous newspaper publishers. One is Joseph Pulitzer, and the other one is William Randolph Hearst, and they began competing for headlines. And so one of the things that we'll see born out of this era is something called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is this idea of exaggerating storylines in order to be able to sell newspapers. So one of the things that happened was that these two newspapers, the newspapers of Hearst and of Pulitzer, they began exaggerating stories about what was happening. Not that bad things were not happening, but one of the things that they said was that Valeriano Weyler, this butcher, was actually going and taking babies, and he was going to the edge of cliffs and dropping the babies into the mouths of feed frenzy sharks, which was not the case. But they were being put in camps, but it didn't matter because the American people were reading these exaggerated stories, and they began demanding that the United States do something about it. The problem is that we couldn't, like I said, because of the Monroe Doctrine. So one of the things that we'll see is that out of fear that the United States might get involved, the Spanish government decided to send a representative to the United States to meet with the president. This guy's name is Enrique Dupuy de Lome. And so they met, and one of the things that happened after the meeting was that Enrique Dupuy de Lome wrote a letter. And in this letter, he criticized the president and actually made him sound like he was weak. And this letter got found, and it was actually stolen, and then it was distributed. It was actually printed, I should say, in the newspapers. And so what happened was the American people began demanding that we go to war with Spain because the Spanish government not only was mistreating the Cuban people, but now it was actually talking smack about the United States. So President McKinley, one of the things he decided to do was that he needed to go and investigate what was going on. So he sent one of our warships, the USS Maine, to Havana to figure out what's going on. When it arrived, it exploded. And as a result of this explosion, the United States had its reason for going to war. And the idea was, remember the Maine. And so we declared war on Spain. So April 11th, 1898, sent the war message to Congress. Interestingly enough, though, one of the things that we see is that not only were we going to go to war in Cuba, but the United States government decided, well, since we're at war with Spain over Cuba, we might as well free the Filipinos from Spanish control. And so one of the things that we did, because we saw the Philippines as a stepping stone to China, was in declaring war with Spain over Cuba, we decided to liberate, quote-unquote, the Filipinos from Spanish control. So we sent Admiral Dewey into the Philippines, and he was able to defeat the Spanish government in the Philippines. And then, while this is all happening, it also made sense for the United States government to annex Hawaii. So when the Spanish-American War began, because it would have made it easier to access our navy, we annexed Hawaii, and it became a territory of the United States. In Cuba, the United States government, the military, was able to steamroll over the Spanish. One of the groups that helped tremendously with this was Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Eventually, the war with Spain ended in essentially a 15 month period, or 15-week period, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1898. So what happens in terms of the Spanish-American War? Cuba is free. Guam and Puerto Rico became territories of the United States, and then we paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines. So one of the things that we'll talk about in class is this idea of whether or not there was a question. Now that we had these territories, are these territories protected by the Constitution? The Supreme Court, in the famous Insular cases that we'll talk about in class a little bit, declared that no, they were not, because they were territories of the United States. The people were not protected, and so therefore they were not citizens. So the United States Congress was essentially free to do as they please, because the island residents were not protected under the 14th Amendment. So Puerto Rico, the Foraker Act of 1900 gave Puerto Ricans limited amount of popular government, and then in 1917 they became full citizens of the United States. We'll talk a little about Puerto Rico in class. In 1898, when we declared war on Spain over Cuba, we actually added what was called the Teller Amendment to the war declaration, in which we said that Cuba would be declared free at the end of the war. So the way to remember the Teller Amendment is this idea that Cuba, sounding like a female name, Teller, as in tell her she will be free. Cuba was instructed to write a new constitution after they were free from Spain. The United States government forced them to include what was called the Platt Amendment into the constitution. And the idea was that the United States could interfere in Cuban domestic and international affairs. The U.S. could trade freely with Cuba, and the U.S. would get Guantanamo Bay, which is a very huge issue today, right? So as a result of this Platt Amendment, Cuba became what is called a protectorate. And so a protectorate is something that we will talk about in class, and I'll compare it to you guys possibly going off to college. The Filipinos, they believed that they were free. They considered themselves free until the United States said, sorry, we are not going to let you be free, right? Because we cannot trust that you are going to be able to run your own government. And realistically, what the United States wanted is they wanted the stepping stone to be closer to China. So William Howard Taft was put in charge of the Philippines, and he called them my little brown brothers. The Filipinos assumed, like I said, they would be given freedom. The guerrilla fighter who helped the United States government during the Spanish-American War, a guy by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo, declared war on the United States, and he led a Filipino guerrilla war against the U.S. So from 1899 to 1901, there is a Filipino-American war. And that they lost. And so the Philippines will not be an independent nation until July 4th, 1946. So we see, in terms of pros and cons of an American empire, we see the formation of what is called the Anti-Imperialist League. Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers, Andrew Carnegie, all these different men. Reasons why, we'll talk a little bit about in class. The British writer Rudyard Kipling, again, like I said, is one of the arguments in favor of imperialism. And then one of the areas that we got involved into was China. So after the Sino-Japanese War that Japan won, China became what is called the sick man of Asia. It became really weak after years of being so powerfully strong. And so it was actually carved up in a similar fashion to that of Africa. The U.S. was alarmed for economic, social, and political reasons that it would be kept out of China. So the President of the United States, McKinley, asked the Secretary of State, John Hay, to send letters or to figure it out. And so what he did is he sent letters to all the different nations like France and Germany and England who were involved in China. We sent letters saying, hey, look, we think that China should be open for business. What do you think? Well, none of the countries responded because they thought that what the United States was trying to do was laughable. So when President McKinley came back to speak to John Hay, and he said, hey, I get it. And so he said, what did the other countries say? And he said, well, they didn't say no. And so President McKinley said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, they didn't say no. So the United States government took that as, of course, since you did not say no, that's a yes. And so the United States showed up to China, and they declared that China was open for business. And this becomes what's known as the open door policy with China. Not all Chinese people were happy with what was going on. And so some of the more conservative Chinese who wanted to maintain Chinese culture and wanted these foreign devils out of the nation, and who were also very much into old Chinese culture, especially in terms of martial arts, they started a rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion because they were martial artists. And they wanted to resist the imperialism of China, but they eventually were unsuccessful. China had to eventually pay $333 million in reparations to all the countries that were affected. Then the election of 1900, very similar to the election of 1896. The Republicans again chose William McKinley, who was pro-imperialism. The Democrats chose William Jennings Bryan, who became anti-imperialistic. And the American people chose McKinley. So what did that mean? They chose imperialism, prosperity, and progress. And then in 1901, immediately following the election, William McKinley was assassinated by a crazy person. The Vice President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, now became president. He was the youngest president at 42. We'll talk a little bit about it in class, like why he was chosen. And so one of the things that happened was he also continued some of the imperialist tradition. His domestic and foreign policy, sort of his status or his motto was the idea of speaking softly but carrying a big stick. So then Panama, Spanish-American War created a need for a route between Atlantic and the Pacific. Unfortunately, in 1850, we signed a treaty with England saying that neither country would build a canal without the permission of the other country. In 1901, the Hay-Penfonte Treaty nullified the 1850 treaty with England. And so there was discussions made about building a possible Nicaraguan canal. The French, though, they began negotiating with Colombia, who owned Panama, about building a Panama Canal. And so eventually the French pulled out of the canal building process, and so the United States said, well, we'll do it. So the U.S. offered Colombia $10 million and a $250,000 a year annuity, and the Colombians said no because they were holding out for more. So essentially the big stick came out, and so what happened is that since he spoke softly, right, Teddy Roosevelt, since he spoke softly and Colombia tried to play us, he essentially brought out the big stick, which in this case is the United States Navy, and we, the Panamanians, rebelled against the Colombians. And so on November 3rd, 1903, because we had helped them gain their independence, the United States began with the process of building the Panama Canal. And it's not finished until 1914, and it ended up costing $400 million. You can see in this picture Teddy Roosevelt. So one of the things that we see with Roosevelt is the extension of the Monroe Doctrine. So Latin American countries were in debt to European ones. So there was a fear that these European countries were going to take advantage of the poverty into these Latin American countries. And so Teddy Roosevelt issued his famous corollary. The idea was that the United States would take over Latin American debts and they would deal with the Europeans. So it's essentially preventing instead of being reactionary. One of the things that Roosevelt had to deal with also is something called the Gentleman's Agreement. The 1906 earthquake actually caused a lot of damage, obviously. But the 1906 earthquake made it really difficult for the city of San Francisco to help the needs of all of its people. And so one of the decisions that the city of San Francisco made was that it was not going to allow its Japanese children to attend the public schools because there wasn't enough room for them. So the Japanese government obviously got really upset at the United States for allowing this to happen. And so Roosevelt, because he wanted to maintain a good relationship with the Japanese, negotiated what became known as the Gentleman's Agreement, that San Francisco would open its doors up again in terms of the schools to the Japanese school children. The Japanese people in San Francisco would be treated better so long as Japan helped in maintaining people in Japan and not letting them leave to the United States. Then we will take a look at President William Howard Taft. He is going to add to Roosevelt's diplomacy, but his is called dollar diplomacy, and the idea was that if you can throw enough money at another country, in this case these poor Latin American countries, they have no choice but to take that money. There's no reason to go in with guns and take them over. Just shower poor countries with money and they will be indebted to you.